So hi everyone, I'm Lapira, and today I'll be presenting to you my research on the analysis and design of steel plates with double curvature. I'll start off by introducing a case study that inspired this research, and then I'll go on to describe the hyperbolic paraboloid, or hypar in short, as a specific example of doubly curved geometry that I'm considering in my research. I'll then present some insights on the results before concluding this presentation. So let's start things off with the case study. And before I started my PhD, I was chatting with friends of mine, Amar and Cameron from COE, about how parametric and digital design tools are challenging engineers with problems that we do not necessarily have the tools to solve. And Amar brought up this really interesting case study of the Inner Harbor Bridge in Copenhagen. Now, the original intent from the design architects was to have the underside of the deck defined by a smooth lofted surface, which I tried to replicate here in green. Now, each of these green panels would assume the form of a hypar, which is a doubly curved surface. And given their location in the bridge, they would be subject to in-plane shear and bending stresses. Currently, there isn't much design guidance for this case. So because of tight deadlines, Amar ended up proposing a faceted design that was eventually built, as you can see in this picture. But the question still remains, how does the hypar behave when subject to in-plane loads? So let's start off with discussing the hypar. Now, you've probably all seen a hypar before. Perhaps you've all seen or come across a Pringle, which is by far the most famous hypar. And you're probably wondering how this matches the previous geometry. Well, if you grab a quadrilateral and rotate it by 45 degrees in the XY plane and project it onto the surface of the Pringle, you get the saddle shape that we see before. And this surface is interesting because it's a ruled surface, meaning that it is formed from straight lines. And this has made it very attractive for the design of long span roofs, such as the Velo Park here in London. Now, when we're looking at hypars in long span roofs, they're very attractive as well because of a very efficient load carrying mechanism, where when we apply an external pressure force to them, it's resisted throughout the majority of the shell by membrane shear. However, in this case, bending just being limited to a very small edge region. However, in our case, because we're looking at a very small plate, if we zoom into that plate and now apply the edge shear to it, we see that we have a size effect where, because of the size of the plate, bending stresses are occurring throughout the plate from the onset of loading, and membrane stresses are no longer dominant. So what we'll be doing in this presentation is exploring this relationship between the external pressure and the applied shear. And we're going to be doing this through numerical models, which I'll introduce now. So we're looking at a single plate in isolation with a height B and thickness T. We'll be varying, in our research, we'll be varying the aspect ratio of the plate, phi, by changing A. And because of this ruled surface property, what we can do is we can vary the offset of the plate in isolation by keeping the projected plan the same. So in this animation, you see the hypar forming with different offsets in terms of the ruled surface. And now we also plot the contours of equal height, which is perhaps a bit more visual to see how the degree of curvature changes with offset. So as a practical load and boundary condition, I'm going to be presenting to you today when we apply shear loads along the edges. And as soon as we apply the shear loads along the edges, we can now term each of the diagonals as a compression and tension diagonal, as a nod to the directions of the initial principal stresses. Because we're looking at a plate, we're concerned with both flexural and membrane boundary conditions. So as a lower bound, we'll look at simply supported plate with constrained edges, which, as shown in this animation here, means that as soon as we apply the shear load, the edges are constrained to remain straight, but can change in length. So starting off with some analysis of the critical shear stresses, I'm doing this for the flat plate, which is presented by this expression in the Eurocodes, where K tau is the shear buckling factor that varies according to this hyperbola, which is based on the aspect ratio of the plates. Now, if we go ahead and plot the first two eigenvalues from our finite element results and seek to classify the eigenmodes that correspond to these eigenvalues, we see that two distinct buckles occurs, one which is symmetric about the tension diagonal and the other one which is antisymmetric about the tension diagonal. So if we go ahead and classify the remaining aspect ratios, we can now predict which mode would be more dominant depending on the aspect ratio. In the interest of time, however, in this presentation, I'll be focusing on the square aspect ratio, and I'll also be presenting my results in terms of a non-dimensionalized load. So in other words, the load that I apply, I non-dimensionalize it with the critical shear stress for the flat plate in order to compare it with the flat plate. And finally, because I'm looking at this plate of square aspect ratio, I can monitor now the out-of-plane deflections of the center node of this plate. So let's get started with the results for the square aspect ratio, looking at the geometric nonlinear analysis carried out in Abacus for a plate of thickness 4. On the right-hand side here, we're plotting the non-dimensionalized load against the out-of-plane displacement of the central node for the flat plate, which buckles at n tilde is equal to 1 as expected, and also demonstrates the strong stable post-buckling response that's typical of plates under shear. Now, as soon as we start looking at hypars with varying levels of offset, we see that deflections start to occur from the onset of loading. And interestingly, as load increases, it almost seems to behave as an imperfect flat plate. However, when we increase the initial geometry or the initial curvature even further, we see that the influence of this initial geometry is more dominant throughout the latter stages of loading. Finally, if I were to consider a material nonlinear analysis as well as a geometric nonlinear analysis, as you can see here, the dashed lines show the result from introducing the yield stress of 690 to the numerical models, and we see that the ultimate load occurs before n tilde is equal to 5. So we can quite safely limit our region of interest to this region. But the real causes for this response are not immediately apparent from the finite element model. So we developed an analytical model where we look at a flat plate and we apply the initial geometry as an imperfection to this flat plate. We then go ahead and solve this using the total potential energy formulation by the Rayleigh's approximation, where in this approach, we assume deflections in U, V, and W that satisfy the boundary conditions. These deflections that we assume, though, include the initial imperfection, W naught. So we then post-process our results to retrieve the actual displacement, W. So a little bit of an introduction to the shape functions that we have. Because we can assume any shape functions, in this case, we're introducing the out-of-plane displacement, for example, as a trigonometric series in W, which is represented by this expression here and depicted on the right. Now, W and N are fundamental harmonics, which are represented by this expression down here. And the interesting thing is that in this approach, we can then isolate the influence of such harmonics on the behavior. So I'll go ahead and show you comparisons of the analytical model against the FE model with increasing load, where the contours show the out-of-plane displacements of the plates. And we get very good correlation between the two. But perhaps looking at it from an equilibrium path instead, where now the analytical lines are the solid lines and dashed lines are the finite element results, we can compare the out-of-plane displacements of the central node against different offsets. And we get very good correlation at low offset, with the prediction deteriorating slightly as the imperfection increases or the degree of curvature increases. And this is because of the amount of terms we've included in our analytical model. But we can now go ahead and look at how the buckle develops along the compression diagonal as we increase in load, as you can see over here, with further waves coming into the behavior. So a key benefit of this analytical model is that we can go one step deeper and see how each of the individual harmonics vary as load increases. So on this plot, what I'm doing is I'm plotting each of the individual harmonics in a different color for the hypar with offset equals to 10 and the flat plate. And as you can see from the onset of loading, the W11 is influential in the hypar, whereas the flat plate has a trivial path. This again shows us the link between the out-of-plane pressure loads and the membrane shear that we discussed earlier. And as loading increases, we see that finally the flat plate buckles, but interestingly, the higher harmonics become more influential, and the contribution of the harmonics in the hypar and in the flat plate are quite similar, which gives us an idea as to why the hypar begins to behave as an imperfect flat plate. And I'll now show why we believe that the introduction of higher harmonics in the response contribute to a stiffening in W. So if we were to consider the compression diagonal as a narrow strip in compression, as is the case because of the way we apply the shear loads, the out-of-plane displacement mode W11 is influential from the onset of loading and is the least stiff mode. And as higher modes begin to become more influential on the behavior, the deflections are more uniform along the strip. And so there are points where deflection cannot occur, and these we term as fictitious strips. The introduction or the increased significance of such modes, therefore, creates a stiffening response and reduces the peak of the overall deflected shape. So in conclusion, in my research, I've shown how the hypar behaves when subject to shear loads, and we've compared this with the flat plates. I've presented to you our analytical model for the behavior, showing excellent correlation with the finite element results. And I've also shown how the fundamental harmonics influence the behavior, confirming both the link between the external pressure and the membrane shear, as well as influencing the stiffening in the post-buckling response. But interestingly, our analytical model gives us a framework which we can apply to any initial geometry and any load case. And from here on out, we've now laid the groundwork to establish some design guidance, where we're finalizing some work on looking at plates of different aspect ratio, and we seek to extend this research into other practical load cases, such as combined axial and shear loads. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll happily take your questions.
Thank you, Luke. It's very interesting to see actually how the analytical model and the finite element model could start to to agree. It's always it must be rewarding when these things line up.
It was a lot of painstaking effort.
Yes, I can imagine. I've asked the people if they have questions, please pop in the chat and I can go to you. Whilst we're waiting for that, I had a main question, which in a sense about applications. And
sure.
Well, so you had the sort of example of the Copenhagen, it was Copenhagen Bridge, wasn't it? And
yes.
So for you to tell us a bit more about where you think this work could apply. Is it on just a few small niche bridges? Are there some potential wide application? Could it open up to us new options of what we do with our structures and how we use steel in those?
I think so, because usually, like, if you have a look at facade engineering and the way we design our facades nowadays, what we end up doing is either having a trussed surface at the bottom to support the cladding for the structure, whereas in this case, as Amar was highlighting too when we were discussing this a couple of years ago, was sometimes some architects, it's nicer to be a bit more purist in that sense, where when we have these new design challenges which are coming up, in digital design and all this application that we have, it would be nice if we could actually produce a more true solution where the structure is actually representing the architecture that we have. And so it's not necessarily just for some niche bridges, but it could also go into any building facades or depending on the architectural solution that were proposed.
Yes, thank you. And I'll go to Dennis straight away. I think he has a question if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Pete. Yes, thank you very much, Luke. Just a quick question. What sort of boundary conditions have you considered in your analysis?
Sure. I've looked at, for the flexural boundary conditions, I'm looking at simply supported boundary conditions. And for the membrane boundary conditions, I'm looking at a constrained edge. So as you can see in this animation here, when the shear load is applied to the edge, the edges are constrained to remain straight, but they can change axially.
Okay. And are you going to consider other boundary conditions, or is that the only conditions you think will only apply for this type of structures?
So in fact, we looked at the simply supported condition as a lower bound approach. And in reality, when we apply stiffeners to this, whether it's a flexural stiffener or a membrane stiffener, the actual behavior will be somewhere in between, fixed-ended and pin-ended. So we will look to extend this into other boundary conditions as well.
Thank you very much.
We have one very last quick question from Glenn Rust from the fellow judge.
Hi, thanks for that very interesting talk, and a problem one has faced in design consultants face a lot. I was interested I'm wondering whether you've looked that bridge you used as an example, whether you've gone back to apply this approach as if you were designing that bridge and that bottom surface, or whether you plan to look at that to see how you could have influenced and changed that design process to come up with a more aligned surface to the original architect's intent.
Sure. No, at this stage, no, we still haven't done that. So as I said in the final slide of my presentation, before we can get to do that, we need to look at some other load cases. So we need to look at different aspect ratios of the plate, because currently we're just like in this presentation, I've limited this to a plate of square aspect ratio. But obviously, when it's looking at it in terms of the whole bridge, we need to look at longer aspect ratios, and as well as seeing the influence of different stiffeners and how that can affect the response. But it'll be really interesting if we could do this by the end of this project, or perhaps in another project, to see if we can look at it and look back at the Inner Harbor Bridge and see how we would solve it.
Well, thank you, Luke. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, for questions, although it was really good to have that discussion going. And time to move on. So thank you very much, Luke, for your presentation and some good questions.